Thank you so much for tuning in today. Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 913th New Social Environment.
Wow.
I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring Stephen Duncombe and Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper. We are also thrilled to welcome poet Elena Alexander here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustained and enriched the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Stephen Duncombe is a lifelong political activist and currently co-founder and research director of the Center for Artistic Activism, a research and training organization that helps activists create more like artists and artists strategize more like activists. Duncombe is also a professor of media and culture at New York University and the author and editor of 8 books and numerous articles on the intersection of culture and politics. And our host today is community builder Reverend Dr. Donna Schaper. Donna served as senior minister of Judson Memorial Church from 2006 to 2021. As an elder, she is passionately concerned about leaving the next generation well prepared for all they have to face. She has written over 35 books, and we are also very lucky to have her as an editor at large here at the Rail. And with that, I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Donna. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's great to see such a nice crowd today. And there's nothing as precious as interviewing an old friend. Stephen and I go way back. I knew his father before him, so that's going to date both of us, who was a United Methodist pastor in New Haven when I was there also. So Stephen, it's wonderful to see you and to know that you're still angling. And angling towards arts and activism around which we have bonded. So my first question for you is this: what is a distinguished professor of history at NYU doing writing a book about fishing?
Well, first, let me start by saying it's always good to talk to you, Donna. I mean, we've had many, many conversations over the years. And, you know, I look forward to many, many more, and I look forward to this one right now. So the question, what is someone like me writing about angling and fishing? And I think that there's 2 answers to that. And they don't really have to do with me being a professor. They actually have to do with the other job I have, the non-paying job, which is as an activist, because I've been an activist since I was 18 years old. I helped form a community or activist organization in the Lower East Side. I've worked with international direct action groups like Reclaim the Streets. So there's a whole other part of me that really has very little to do with NYU. NYU is my day job, as I like to say. And my night and weekend job is being an activist. And for the past 10 or 12 years, really working around the world and working, one of the great things I've been able to work with amazing artists and amazing activists, literally about 28 countries at this point. So this really comes out of the activist part of me. And part of the activist part of me, and I think this had to do with growing up in an activist family, is the fear that activism gets cut off from other parts of everyday life. And I was thinking about, when I was asked to be on this, I was thinking about the first article I ever wrote for Brooklyn Rail, first and only article I ever wrote for Brooklyn Rail, to all that matter, which was 15 years ago, which was about what activists could learn from Grand Theft Auto, the video game. And the conceit behind that was that activism can often start to speak its own language and start to just be preaching to the choir. And, you know, the choir needs to be preached at as well, as I know, having been a member of Donna's church. But we also, if we're going to win, we need to reach out to a lot more people. And a lot more people, I hate to say it, play video games than are activists, or perhaps even go to church. Fishing, it turns out, is the #1 leisure activity in the United States. It is something a lot of people do. So part of this really has to do with me trying to connect popular cultural pursuits with activism, partially in an effort to make activism more popular. So when we train activists, for example, one of the things we do, we usually train them over a course of a week, and it usually stretches over the weekend. And one of the activities we do over the weekend is we have a cultural event. Now, everybody always thinks that, okay, we're going to have a cultural event. What we're going to do is we're going to see some amazing poet, like we have here today, who's going to write poetry about some political issue, or we're going to see a documentary film on some sort of activist struggle. That's exactly what we don't do. Instead, what we do is we find out what other people, non-activists, are doing in whatever locale we are, and we go do that. So we go to casinos, we go to nightclubs, we go to baseball games. And then the next day, we all get together and say, hey, as you looked around, what did you notice that people really enjoyed in this activity? And then we ask, how can we take some of those lessons and bring it into our activism so people can enjoy our activism, and the parts of us that like to go to casinos, watch rom-coms, what have you, can actually bring that into activism as well. So in some ways, this is really just part of this long activist kind of trajectory I've had, which is about merging activism and popular culture. On the other hand, this came out of COVID. I was isolated, alone, blissfully on the tip of Cape Cod, which has some of the best fishing in the United States, both in the oceans and in the ponds. And I wanted an activity in which I didn't have to think about the political apocalypse that was happening, and where I could be by myself and not wear a mask. I'd been fishing when I was young, and then I stopped when I was about 12 years old. So I had to reteach myself how to fish. And as I retaught myself how to fish, I started seeing parallels between the activism work I was still doing, albeit online, vicariously, what have you, and the things I was learning while I was fishing. And so I started to draw these parallels. And fishing is a great place to do this sort of thinking. And it's no accident there's so many sort of philosophical books about fishing, because anybody who's done a fair amount of fishing knows how unbelievably boring fishing is. You have a lot of time to think and a lot of time to ponder. And one of the things I thought a lot about was activism.
What a great answer, and so well-rounded. Isn't it amazing what great thoughts you can have when you slow down?
Completely. I mean, you know this from gardening.
Right.
Because you've written about gardening and activism and thoughtfulness and so on. And there's something really nice about pulling your head out of an activity in order to then see the activity again. And part of that is a slowing down. You're right.
I won't go so far as to thank COVID for coming to us, but on the edge of that, gratitude. It's interesting that such a great book could come out of it. And also relearning a childhood pastime. I did not know that fishing was one of the most popular activities or sports. I just didn't know that. I mean, I know I see people standing for long times and think, how are they doing that?
Yes, it is. I mean, again, that statistics comes from, the fishing association, so we can take it with a grain of salt. And fishing tends to be gendered. It's mainly men who are fishing. It doesn't break down on race.
Right.
Of all races fish. It actually probably skews a little bit more towards the working classes than anything else, although fly fishing attracts the kind of the upper crust. But it is, at least for men in the United States, a very widespread activity. It's also one that one doesn't think about when they think about progressive activism. And so I love playing with that sort of expectation and upsetting of expectations.
Yeah, well, we need so many more great things for men to do to keep them out of trouble. And we need so many more things that that calm the
Yeah.
masculinity out of people.
Mhm.
It certainly is very different than football, right?
Yeah. It is. I mean, there's no denying that fishing is a violent sport. And one of the things I wrote about in the book is about acknowledging the blood and the pain that you inflict upon fishing, even when you, as most fishermen do, and fisherwomen do, anglers do, you do catch and release. There still is a cost, but there's a cost in activism as well. The fact is, when I run a campaign and we're successful, we put people out of business. And while it's great that we're putting some capitalists out of business, we also put their workers out of business. And that there's a cost to that as well. It doesn't mean you don't do it. It just means to acknowledge that there is a cost. But what's nice about fishing is that you're right, it is calm. It is very relaxing. It puts you in touch with nature. Some of the first conservationists, certainly in the United States, I don't know if this is true worldwide, were hunters and anglers, because they were the people who actually spent time in the wild and saw the incursions in the wild of suburbanization and urbanization and pollution.
Right. Yeah, and I think fishing is also an excuse. Angling is also an excuse to get by the water.
Yes.
And sometimes you need the excuse. I mean, do you ever watch people go to the beach, carrying, 50 pounds of the home to the water? And you wonder, couldn't you just go there and sit on a towel?
But you're absolutely right, Donna. And it forces you at a very early point in the morning. Usually I am out fishing at 5 a.m. in the morning because the fish tend to bite at 5 to 7 or from like 7 to 9. And it forces you out in the water. So before I would even begin working, I would have spent an hour and a half on the water. And most of it fishing and not catching, but listening to the waves roll in and looking out onto the horizon, or if I'm fishing in a pond, seeing all of the little wildlife that scurries around in the morning and floats towards you, even on Central Park Lake, in which I do a fair amount of fishing. I'll probably go tomorrow morning, actually. To wake up with the lake or wake up with the ocean is a really profoundly calming and humbling experience.
Well, people take the sea cure. They have in all countries for, hundreds and hundreds of years. So it is a modest form of cure. So let's move over to activism and art. In a certain way, polar opposites. I think of art as the finished, the finished something, the complete something. The sonnet has 14 lines and that's all you get. So complete it. And then I think of activism as absolutely never ending, almost incompletable as a task.
Yeah.
And I was very taken yesterday when you talked about the angling as a metaphor for activism and art, that what was important is the process.
Yeah.
We hear that all the time, and I want your great mind to tell me more about that.
Sure. One of the things you learn very early on in fishing is that you don't catch that many fish. When you do, it's super exciting. It may lead to a wonderful meal. But most of your time is fishing, not catching, as the old adage goes. And so you have to learn how to love the process. You have to learn to love the casting out and reeling in, reading the shoreline, being in nature. You have to love trying to figure out what the fish are doing, because that's 95%, 99% of what you're doing. And that, of course, is the same thing with activism. I meet a lot of young activists who are super gung-ho. And what I always counsel them is something I learned from my father, actually, which is, it's great to be gung-ho. We don't need you to be gung-ho for 6 months. We need you to be keep doing it for about 75 years. And that's when change happens. And so, part of being an activist is endlessly engaging in the process for very few wins. And when the wins come, you have to start the process all over again. So we tend to think of the arts as a painting or a sonnet or a finished poem. But I'm sure, as Elena knows, that actually that finished poem is just the very end part of a long, long process, and probably isn't even finished then. I love that Walt Whitman kept rewriting Leaves of Grass over and over and over and over again. And I love that sort of idea of the understanding of art too as a process. I mean, when I was thinking about probably a piece of political art most people know, Picasso's Guernica. He made 47 sketches. He changed major things up until the day before it was actually delivered. And if he had kept a hold of it for another month, it would have changed more radically still. So when people think about art and activism, they often think about that mural or that song. What we try to think about is actually not the product, but the creative process that you bring to everything. And so when organizations say, well, we want to bring some artists into our organization, we'll say, well, where do you want to bring them in? They're like, well, we want them to design our posters. We're like, no. You have to bring them in at the very beginning when you start talking about strategy, when you start talking about tactics, because the creative process is about thinking about protests as art, thinking about meetings as art. And that's what really art has to give to activism, is to rethink our fundamental assumptions about things.
I love that. And, both art and activism and just about anything worth its salt is often the victim to stereotypes. You're so right. You look at that finished product and then you move on to the next picture.
Yeah.
And
that's that, we get caught in ruts. We get caught in ruts, certainly fishing. You get caught in ruts. This lure is going to work over and over. This spot is going to work. And then one day the fish just move on and you have to go someplace else. Or all of a sudden they're not interested in the fly that you've been using because the hatch moved on, and you have to constantly innovate in order to catch a fish. Well, the same thing with activism. I mean, a march is great. A rally is great. At one time, however, they were the most innovative thing ever, right? And so we have to learn how to innovate as well. There's nothing wrong with the march, but let's think about what a march means in 2023 as opposed to 1903. Does it have the same impact? Does it have the same effect? Or worse, this is something in my putting my research hat on, I discovered in running these experiments about creative and conventional forms of activism. If activism looks like activism, this stereotype of activism, people often are turned off.
Right.
They move away. It's when activism can raise the question for people, what is that? Okay, I don't quite understand that. Oh, that's what it is. That's when you have the brief couple of moments of surprise, which art at its best is always about surprise, which opens people up. And so they can actually rethink something that they've settled on before.
Yeah. So let's go to the book. Let's just look at it and give us an introduction while we get the slides up, and tell us who did the illustration, etc.
So one of the great things about this book is I got to work with my niece, Elizul Duncombe Mills. And I always knew her as a niece. I knew her as a talented artist. But when I was thinking about this book, I said, well, I want to imagine as if I had talent. And when the fish weren't biting, I would take out my sketchbook and draw these little sketches. And so I asked my niece, could you do that for me? And one of the greatest things about this book was actually getting to know her as an artist. And we would go back and forth, and I would say, okay, I'm doing this little section, because how the book is structured is there's a long paragraph on fishing, and then it's long paragraph, a one on activism as well. And I wanted an illustration for each of those. And so sometimes I'd give her very direct cues. I want a picture of a fishing reel. Sometimes she would read them and come up with her own. The one that prefaced this, The Fish on the Plate, was about what constitutes a good day. For me, a good day is just catching a fish, but I also fish with people for whom their livelihood depends on fishing. Their meals depend on fishing. And so their idea of a good day and what is appropriate is very different than mine. And so we would talk about that, and she'd go, I know, I'm going to draw a picture of a fish on a plate, and I would say, that's wonderful, go with that. And so, yeah, so some are more illustrative, some are more associative, but I love the drawings. I love the drawings. I honestly think they're much better than the writing.
Yeah. Well, the way that fish is on that plate is hilarious to me.
Exactly.
It's like, I don't know if I want to eat it or just laugh at
Yes,
it.
yeah, exactly. It looks bewildered too, which I kind of like.
What? What's a nice fish like me doing in a
Doing
place like
here.
this?
Why am I here? Exactly.
First question. And I love the structure, Stephen, of the book.
Okay.
I really liked the kind of keeping the activities and the thoughts separate together.
Yeah.
So that's just really nice for your thesis, for what you were trying to say. Let's go down to the golden calf. Come on, let's go down and talk a little activism. Now, folks, that's Stephen in the front center. And that was our then music director from Judson. And I don't know who the people in the back are. I tried to identify some of them, but, Occupy was 10 years ago, 13 years ago now. And I just want to introduce you to the calf. I guess it's Animal Day on the Brooklyn Rail. And we're using these animals as props for ourselves. The calf was built by the Catholic workers in Baltimore who called us up and said, don't you need a golden calf in the shape of the Wall Street Bull? And of course we said yes. And they literally finished it in a U-Haul truck on the way up from Baltimore on Saturday night. I'm thinking mid-September, almost like right this time. And we were so stunned by how beautiful it was and what a great symbol it was for what we were trying to do with Occupy, that we literally just sat down and read the golden calf story in the Bible to each other for about an hour, and then took the opportunity to opportunize it as a symbol, which I do think that art and activism also connect opportunistically. Wow. Yeah. We didn't know we needed that, but there you just brought it to us. Thank you. And the calf moved out the Judson door. Tell me about the costumes. Why did you guys decide to wear what you were?
We brought out our best suits to try to emulate as best as possible Wall Street brokers who would be worshiping the golden calf.
Right, exactly.
Yes, exactly. So, that's me as a proto Wall Street banker. Kind of a little scruffy for a Wall Street banker, but still, we were doing our best.
Right. And
go on.
Just that one story I always have to tell people about the calf is as it marched down Thompson Street towards Zuccotti Square, people literally it was because it was fall, people were on porches and outside. It wasn't a COVID outside, it was just outside drinking Bloody Marys. I watched dozens of people put their Bloody Marys down on the table and skip the check and say things and get in line behind the calf. So we picked up about 300 brunchers on the way down to Zuccotti that day when we first let the calf out. And then, like all old art, it became a real problem and kind of fell apart. So.
Yes, which is okay. It served its purpose. But, and I was thinking about what was so kind of wonderful about Occupy Wall Street, and this was true of a lot, Arab Spring and what was happening in Spain in May of that year, and then as occupations kind of spread the world, is that they became a stage for all sorts of performances. Like we're going to stage what a different sort of library would be like. We're going to stage a golden calf and then have a ceremony down there where if you remember, Warren impersonated a rabbi, as I remember, which may have damned him to hell. We will find out at some point. But that one of the things that was great about Occupy is, at its best, it kind of understood that politics was a performance.
Right.
That, if you think about what those, the meetings were like, for example,
Yeah.
or the people's mic were like, they were actually pretty dreadful in terms of making decisions or communicating information, but symbolically, they were beautiful.
Yeah.
Because, take people's mic, for example. I say a few words, then you say a few words, the same words, and then it goes back and back and back throughout the crowd. All of a sudden, it takes away the power of the man with the microphone and makes every utterance into a people's utterance. And that was beautiful. And so I think that at its best, Occupy made protest into an art, or recognize the art that's part of every protest.
I agree. So listen, Eleanor and Chloe, I have gotten bounced off. I'm still listening, but I think, why don't you go ahead with the slideshow? I'm going to go off and come back on. Okay.
I can talk. Well, let's just look at the slides for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, keep going.
Stephen, can you tell us a little bit about some of the illustrations that we're looking at?
Sure. I was waiting for one to kind of prompt me, but I can talk about this one. So actually, I'll talk about this one. Okay, no, we'll talk about that one. We could take a people's vote, which way they want to. We can talk about beginnings and endings. One of the things that's great about fishing, the most beautiful moments of fishing, are the timelessness of it, which is literally hours slip away. I often don't have that amount of time. I have 45 minutes till I have to go back and make lunch or breakfast for the kids, right? Or I have an hour and a half before I need to be at work. And so there's often sharp endings. But the most blissful, beautiful days are those when, like, I'll ride a bike up to Central Park at 6 in the morning, and then I'll just stay. And time kind of disappears, and it's very rare in our scheduled lives in which you have that sort of floating time. And so one of the things that fishing taught me is the value of sort of this floating time. And as an activist, it's the worst thing you can do. That really you need to have beginnings and endings. We've all been at meetings in which the organizer of the meeting doesn't put a hard stop on the end, and they extend and they extend, and then you feel guilty, and sooner or later you slip out the back. And the only people that end up staying at the meeting are the people that have no place else to go, who are not the people you want running the revolution. And so one of the things I've thought a lot about, and when we train activists, is to think about your protest as choreographed as a good performance, that it has a start, it has a finish, it has acts, it has an arc. Because if we don't come up with the finish, usually the police will, and that means we end up telling their story, not our story.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, that's great. I'm listening, but I can't get any video. So have we finished with the slides?
No, we're going to go through them, but we can just talk while they kind of are this backdrop, Donna.
Okay, good. Keep going through the slides and I'll keep listening, and I'm going to keep trying to get on. I'm going to try my other device.
Yeah, it's okay. There's nothing to see.
Right.
Just me and the slides.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things about this slide is about that fishing is paradoxically really a solitary sport, leisure activity, where you really have to be by yourself and be with yourself a lot of times. And I think that activists do well to understand that. Social change comes about through working with a lot of other people. But if you don't make space and time for yourself, you will burn out. And again, I've been at this now for 40 years, and I've seen more people burn out and leave activism because they didn't find space and place to take care of themselves, and having time away from being an activist, and a time being away from all that stress and activity. That's as important, so you can recharge yourself, so you can continue on doing activism over a long haul. This bright red blood, again, is an idea of that there are consequences. There are consequences to fishing, and there's consequences to activism. And we have to acknowledge that. People do get hurt. Protesters get hurt by the police, but our adversaries get hurt if we're successful in doing what we're doing. That doesn't mean we don't do it. I still organize protests where there's a chance that people are going to get hurt, and I still do campaigns where we're actively trying to hurt a corporation. But it means understanding and taking responsibility for that as well, and doing it with eyes wide open. I'm gonna let a couple go before I feel inspired to talk about one.
Donna, I think you're still here. Donna, do you want to?
I am still here.
We hear you.
I
Yeah.
know, but I can't see you.
Oh, no.
I can't.
Do you see a Zoom?
I just came back.
There we go. We love to see it. Okay. I'll let
Okay.
you and Stephen keep going.
Carry on. You're doing great.
Let's see, what's the next one? Catch on. Oh, it's a beautiful one.
Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of the other side of causing pain, is trying to realize how to inflict as little pain as possible at people. But also acknowledging that that is a bit of a luxury. I can afford to catch and release my fish. Other people can't. They exist and fish to survive. I just went fishing this weekend with my friend Ibu, who's an activist from Senegal, and he was amazed that we were giving the fish back. It was like, we don't give the fish back. We have to eat them. He doesn't, but his cousins who are professional fishermen have to eat them, and that's what professional anglers have to do. And it's what the people I fish with in Hudson River, even though we shouldn't be eating them, I give my fish to them because they use them to either sell or to supplement the food for their family. And so some of this kind of an undercurrent of this book is really about privilege, which is what sort of privilege do I have as a white, cis, male, middle-class activist, and also what sort of privilege do I have as, one of the chapter's titles is a white man fishing on the Cape. The only reason I can have this experience of fishing on the Cape or in Hudson River or Central Park is because, Europeans stole the land from the Lenape and the Nauset in Cape Cod. And so even this great enjoyment is based on a sense of privilege and having privilege. So what does one do with that? What does one do with your privilege? Do you feel guilty about it? Self-flagellation? I hate guilt because guilt to me is always bringing the privilege back to thinking about how privileged you are. In other words, it refocuses on your privilege. It privileges the privileged. Or what you can do is pretend that you have no privilege and just go blissfully along in the great white way of pretending that you don't have privilege, but that leads to dishonesty and a sort of bitterness when people call you out on your privilege. And so, I think what one does with privilege, and this is not a novel thought, is you use it. You use it to try to create a society that does away with privilege.
Yeah, you try to put yourself out of business.
You try to put yourself out of business. And that's what a good activist does, is they try to put themselves out of business, right? We do a exercise with the Center for Artistic Activism in our training, which is imagine winning, where we ask people, well, what would a win look like? And it's usually a very short-term goal for the campaign they're working on. Okay, you got that. What would you do next? And what would you do next? What would you do next? What would you do next? And the idea is to get them to this utopian place, this utopian vision, where it's broad, it's beautiful, it's positive, in part so they can use that utopia to motivate themselves, but also to motivate other people as well, right? Because everyday people aren't interested in passing House Bill number 375, but they are interested in a world of justice where people are happy. So you got to have that utopian ideal. But invariably, what ends up happening when we do these is the final utopia for all these activists is, I don't have to be an activist anymore.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Or even think about it, like in terms of sickness or hunger or war. You just want those things to be out of business so everybody can go fishing all the time.
Exactly. Exactly.
And, keep what they need. There's no, nothing enrages me as an activist more than how the healthcare system really needs people to be really sick.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the funny thing is, COVID may have saved what little modicum of healthcare public healthcare we have in this country, because in part, it demonstrated that we need a healthcare system. It saved the NHS in Britain.
Right.
By the way, this is one of my favorite of all illustrations. And this is the one my niece came up with by herself when I referred to Ram Dass in one of my things, which is she made a mandala of fish. And it was the lesson is about being present in the moment. And trying. The great thing about fishing is that you're there and you're paying attention to every little twitch in your rod, but at the same time, when you do that, your mind can expand elsewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I can jump on the privilege question, for some people, art is optional. It's a hobby.
Yeah.
Other people can't help themselves. They just have to do something, make something, express something. For some people, activism is optional. For most of the people in the world, on the last show, we talked about how 6% of us used up all the energy in developed countries and 94% didn't. And so what is their obligation? Is activism about climate activism, or is it just survival?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think those kind of images for the necessity of art, the necessity of activism, can help the privilege get real.
It's funny because there's also a way that sometimes, when I've been doing this sort of creative activism, art activism, every once in a while, it's usually someone with privilege, will say, but isn't this artistic activism, isn't this creative activism a privilege of the privileged? Of which I immediately point out, actually, if you look at all of the movements of the most oppressed and downtrodden, they are some of the most creative movements. My go-to is always the civil rights movement, which thought about every act as a strategic dramaturgy, right? And this makes sense because other spheres, a legal strategy, for example, or an electoral strategy, they count on being in a certain position in society, knowing something about laws, knowing something about elections, which actually is restricted to very few people. Everybody is creative. If you look at the popular arts, at least, you look at that they're really the possession of the people with the littlest and the least on society. Where would popular arts be in the United States without Black folks? Where would it be without queer folks? Where would it be without poor folks? We would have Lawrence Welk. Although it turns out Lawrence Welk was actually the son of poor Welsh miners, so we wouldn't even have Lawrence Welk. And so it's really this idea that actually the great thing about creativity is it's something that is the possession of far more people than other ways of doing activism. So creative activism, I would argue, is a popular activism. We just have to tap into everyday people's creativity.
Yeah, you make beauty out of suffering, you make beauty out of trouble, and you do it because you do it.
Yeah. So this is Simon, which we both know, Donna. And so I do want to tell a story about fishing with my family dog, because I think it's a good story. And I'm looking at the time, and maybe even a good story to end on. Simon is my beloved family dog, and I would love it. I would love to go fishing with him. He also turns out to be the worst fisher dog ever. You go down to the water and he barks. You go cast into the water, he chases the lure. You pull the lure out of the water, he jumps at it and almost hooks himself. He is terrible. And so I cannot go fishing with him.
Right.
But I do all sorts of other things with him. I go for walks, we cuddle on the couch, and so on. And it made me think about friendships, and about how most of my friends are activists, and I love being with them. But I also have a fair amount of friends, and particularly old friends, who are not activists and actually don't share my politics at all. And I can't talk to them about politics, yet I can still be friends with them. And I actually think that having these friendships with people who I can't talk politics about makes me a better political person, insofar as I can start to understand a little bit about how other people see the world, but also understand a little bit how to talk to those people. Again, sometimes I worry about activists that we just know how to talk to one another. We've got our lingo down. We've got the right thing to do and the right way to be. We've got our rituals, and they essentially alienate people. And whether we like it or not, if we believe in democracy, we need to have a majority on our side, which means learning how to speak to people which are not like us. A lot of the people I go fishing with are not like me. And as an activist, I need to know how to speak to them.
Yeah, and that's very, very challenging. And I think it's one of the topics that I find in my circles, people talk about the most is I need to start talking with people I disagree with. I'm desperate for it. What's that? Something's broken.
Oh, and this just happened last weekend. I broke a rod just as I caught a big bluefish. And just some days things go terribly. Everything goes wrong. Sometimes days go brilliantly, right? A lot of times things go terribly. You just got to go through it.
Yeah.
Because as an activist, there are just years in which you lose over and over and over again. Nobody seems to be interested in it. And then all of a sudden, Occupy Wall Street happens. And people are talking about the issues that you've been talking about for years and years and years. Or Black Lives Matter happens. And all of a sudden, you've been talking about racial injustice and structural racism for years. No one cares. And all of a sudden, now people are caring. Now people are marching. And you have to have done that work in order to be ready for those moments. I have a friend, Dred Scott, who's a really great art activist. And he also happens to be an avid bike racer. And he said, you know, it's like if you're into bike racing and you entered the Tour de France, for the 8 years when Lance Armstrong was in the Tour de France, you never were going to win. And so why did you do it? Because in the 9th year, he wasn't going to be in it. And then you could win. But you had to keep training over those 8 years or you wouldn't have been for that 9th year. And I've always loved that story of Dred's.
Yeah, that's a good story. Timing is, in fact, everything. And things are happening when you're not angling too.
Yes, exactly.
They're happening all over the place. I mean, I've been making this joke that about 4 years ago now, when Pope Francis first came into office, I said, read Laudato Si, one of his magnificent books on ecology. And I said, his very arguments will assure that women will be ordained and queers will be ordained. It's just a question of time. And I have been mocked for having said that continuously. And guess what was reported yesterday in the New York Times?
What?
Well, the Pope is convening a synod that will last for 45 days. And a lot of women and a lot of gay people are coming to it. And there's every reason to believe now it's going to take forever. Talk about timing. even if they decide to go ahead with this at this synod, which I think they will, again, predicting good news, perhaps falsely, it won't go into effect until 2 years.
But still, that's amazing.
Well, something's going to happen. And so I had given up, and I apologized to all my friends that I had said that, that I was wrong.
Mhm.
And the book is called I Heart You, Francis, Love Letters from a Reluctant Admirer.
I love that.
And I even got a letter back from him.
What? I
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah, and now I'm getting my book in the bookstore at Rome. I'm kidding. for the synod. But timing is everything.
Timing is everything, and doing it for the long haul is everything as well.
Right.
And Donna, you have taught me that.
Yeah.
That you got to love being in there every day, and part of that is you've got to make the everyday something you love.
Yes.
And both of those things have to operate. You have to figure out how to make activism, like fishing, something you really enjoy, something you love, not just because it's good for the world.
Right.
Also,
That's the dumbest reason of all.
yeah.
Doing something good for somebody else. You got to do it that it's good for you. And that's why I love the book, because everybody wants to know how people keep going. And my answer is it's the aesthetics of organizing that make it worth doing. It is an aesthetic action. Don't ever ask a painter, why'd you paint that? Well, I painted it because I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
By you.
Yeah.
All right, you get one last word, then we're going to take questions.
I like ending on your word. This is activism as an aesthetic action. An aesthetic action, both in terms of the object it produces, something beautiful, something enjoyable, something thought-provoking, but also the creative process that goes into it.
Right. Cool. Well, we'll end our dialogue and give it over. I bet we have questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donna. And thank you so much, Stephen, for those insights. That was a really interesting conversation, and it was such a treat to look at these beautiful illustrations. If anyone else would like to ask a question to Stephen, please raise your hand or send a message in the chat. But to start off the Q&A, I would like to ask you a question, Stephen.
Yeah.
I'm curious about, while you're, or I guess in relation to your work with the intersection between art and activism, I'm curious about the position of public artworks, like installations in public spaces, versus works that are in more institutions that are like maybe not less accessible, but just a little bit less in your day-to-day life. And if you have any thoughts on, how art can be activism in terms of its public nature or private.
Sure. Actually, some people's names here who could probably answer that question better than I could. But I will do my best since you asked me. I mean, what good is the most brilliant piece, most provocative piece of artwork if no one actually sees it, right? And so, one of the things that when I work with artists, and I work with them a lot now about trying to get them to think about their impact and assessing their impact. And one of the things that I talk to them a lot about is audience. Who do you want to impact, and what do you want them to think, feel, and do? Now, this is a training for theater artists. They think about their audience a lot, but visual artists actually don't think about them. And they're often just trained to think about their audience as themselves. And that kind of can lead to, well, if I just show it in a gallery, everything will be fine. But getting artists, when you ask them, particularly social artists, to think about their audience, they usually, with a little thought, actually have a pretty clear idea of who they want to impact. And then the next question I ask is always like, well, how do we get your artwork in front of them? right? And that might be public in terms of a square, but it also might be distributed online or, printed up in a graphic novel. But to really think very seriously about who do you want to reach, what do you want them to think and do, realigns people to start thinking about audience. And most artists I know, the social artists I know, want to actually impact large publics, or sometimes very particular publics in power and so on. And then we think about what's the best place to reach those publics. It may be actually the best place to reach some public, like if you want to impact the board of directors at MoMA, is actually in a small museum, right? Or in a gallery. If you want to impact a large voting public, I'm working with this Cleveland voting rights organization. Well, then what we need to do is find out where everybody is on a Saturday morning. So I'll give you one more story. I know this is too long for an answer, but it's a story from the book, which is about fishing where the fish are. So when I first started fishing, I didn't catch anything. And my family just teased me relentlessly about you were the world's worst fisherman, right? And then I realized something after I started talking to the locals. I wasn't catching anything because I was fishing where there weren't any fish. And as soon as I found out where the fish were, I started catching lots and lots of fish, right? And so this was actually one of the things that started this book, because at that time I was working with a group of artists and activists in the West Africa and the Western Balkans on this big 3-year project on anti-corruption. And I was talking to a bunch of activists who were working in Serbia. And they were strategizing about where they were going to do their protest in Belgrade. And there's a usual place where activists always do their protests and so on and so forth. And I started talking about fishing and gave them the story about you got to fish where the fish are and not where the fish aren't. And they were like, what the hell are you talking about? I said, well, where do people go on a Saturday? And they said, they go to the market. And then we said, well, that's where you're going to go. You're going to go to the market because that's where the people are.
That's such a great answer, Stephen. Thank you so much. And I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience at the moment. If anyone does have one, please feel free to jump in. But before we introduce our poet, Elena, I just wanted to see if, Donna, you had any last questions for Stephen, or Stephen, even if you have a question for Donna.
Well, my question for you, Stephen, would be, what do you think is going to be the next surprise?
You mean politically?
Yeah. Politically, economically.
I don't want to bum people out. Well, actually, no. I think actually the unsurprising answer to that is there's going to be a lot more violence.
Yes.
And particularly right-wing violence. A friend of mine said, we're headed into 1968, but 1968 for the right. And so I think that is something we're going to see. I think what might be surprising is people kind of acknowledging that the way that we think about politics and economics just doesn't work anymore. And therefore, and I think we're seeing the ugly side of that right now. All of this rage is coming out of an ugly reaction to that. But the positive reaction is we were the ones who imagined this political system, this economic system to being in the first place. We can reimagine it in a radically different way as well.
Yeah.
Art is good for that, because art is a place for imagination, and it's a way to prefigure the world that we want to bring into being, as well as critique the world that we live in now.
Yeah. As Micah Busey at Judson, now the new senior minister, says, artists are the prophets. Watch them.
Yeah.
Listen to what they say and really listen to it. And I think that is absolutely true in a kind of post-religious time. And I just I don't think we need any Jeremiahs wandering around looking half nuts, screaming at people. I really don't. I think we need very quiet. What were you experiencing the night after the smoke hit New England, June 6th and 7th? And people all over New England said, oh my God, it's here. Yeah. And then we had to talk to our friends in California and say, yeah, we have it, 6 out of 8 days, the last 4 months. How you doing? How's your cough? You know, and how do you talk to people about climate despair or this notion, climate grief, this notion that there's nothing you can do about it, right? That just isn't true at all.
I think so. And so one of the groups we work with a lot is Greenpeace. And so we train a lot of their activists. And why Greenpeace brought us in was because we believe in utopia. Because what they were worried about is that their messaging and the environmentalist movement's messaging was dystopian. And that was the rut, right? The routine, the stereotype, which was the doom and despair. And what they felt is it was turning people off from action, is that they wanted to learn how to dream and dream of a better world that would inspire, not just motivate people out of fear.
Yeah. And we just did one of our last shows, Stephen, I don't know how you would know about it, but that Rebecca Solnit did with her remarkable book about It's Not Too Late, with, 14 really positive climate activists telling what they were doing to make it work. And that's the story we need to hear, as opposed to the right story of, you're not going to win, you're too stupid, you're too idealistic, you're too whatever, all of which is such a masquerade for white power. Such a masquerade, a very thin masquerade, but nevertheless, it works for them, right?
Yeah, I don't even know how much they're masquerading nowadays about white power. I think it's kind of unfortunately out in the open.
I know. Yeah.
Well, that was a really powerful note to end on. So thank you so much, Stephen and Donna. This has been lovely. And we do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding with a poetry reading, and I'm really excited to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Elena Alexander, to the stage. Elena Alexander is a poet and writer. Her work appears in anthologies published by Penguin and New York Up, among others, and in publications including Aloud, Voices from the Nuyorican Poets Cafe, and American Letters and Commentary. Work can also be found in Bomb, the Brooklyn Rail, and elsewhere. Elena, we're so happy to have you, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Really, that was so amazing. So thanks to Stephen and to Donna for that thoroughly enlivening and heart-inspiring conversation. I want to thank Anselm Berrigan for choosing 3 of my poems for the September just past Brooklyn Rail, and to Carolyn Ferrucci for reading them there and inviting me here. And thanks also to Fangui at all times, because he is the founder of the Rail. I continue to dedicate all readings I do at present to Salman Rushdie and to our unsung heroes, our librarians. Okay, 2 quick notes on the first. I'm going to read 2 poems, and these are notes on the first one, and they were in that September issue, and there was a third. But 1, this is just one woman's surly opinion on a prevailing fashion, and 2, the fox mentioned in the poem, in this first poem, since it will just fly by your ears, is Tucker Carlson. Okay, and the following is a quote from Salman Rushdie, who said, "In the end, it's the books that matter, not the knives." Okay, so first poem. Holy. Why, I wonder, do ripped men or denims count as high fashion? I guess that flesh over abs teaches us to admire perseverance, but so do people on crutches. Choosing holes in clothes? My lovely baby alpaca shawl, now ruined by telltale see-through spots made by diligent egg-laying moths, speaks neither bespoke nor slang, only of carelessness in allowing the care and feeding of insects. I dearly preferred it before it got eaten. Then what does it mean when thirsty cotton costs more for what is not there than what is? a way to save water? Certainly not, pardon me, certainly not a way to save cash. I find their gashed persistence a minus in more, I find their gashed persistence a minus in more than missing fabric. Does the sweatshop worker making millions of them for pennies and all manner of outlets also wonder? Might that person hunched over love to own something new and whole straight up? Does faux poverty obviate hunger via mind-numbing, ear-thwacking machines, stitch by stitch? Do I sound like that ersatz journalist, Fox's former Fox in USA's henhouse, still fouling the air elsewhere, asking obvious rhetorical questions, able to petition the already initiated in what it means to stop thinking? That thought is far worse than nits or pricks in soft wool, damaged at worst by less than glam Lepidoptera, dun-colored, unbeautiful, unwitting, unable to rip away what embraces me hardest when cold evenings or insights arrive. Not sacred, just irksome. These empty spaces, no real harm, keep me warm. This second and final poem is in 8 short sections. It's called Bad Bodhisattva. 1, hard enough to be in the shower when I am in the shower, to worry, reciting or thinking Dharma. This very argot, incipient figures kept dry while water runs, move outside like clumps of coke, become adjacent lines. Mind a razor's edge, dull or sharp. 2, I am intentionally bereft. My equanimity grew thorny as my doubts simply grew. Bad Bodhisattva. I saw that I wanted, we all want, I wanted the world beyond the formal Sangha, have never done well in prescribed groups. 3, can you be a lapsed Buddhist, erstwhile Bodhisattva? The vows say no, and in some ways serving others suits me. I had a former sister-in-law who'd been a Catholic nun. My renunciation wasn't to torment, just a slow and gentle sinking, though sitting still floats. 4, I stopped studying the precepts, already lived most, screwed up others. Adultery, something adults do. Intoxication, you bet. 5, living by conditions set by men of wisdom. I think about this. Have my doubts about their interpreters. Have yet to find the man's voice speaking in parables and admonitions I should follow, as I do those lines laid down by poets, the truly grand humblers. 6, some number of poets whose poems I admire practice the practice. Also many cloying poems I detest. Judgment, judgment, bad Bodhisattva. 7, mindfulness, one of the words of the day. One can be mindful building a poem or a bomb. Here, once upon always, is intention. 8, paying attention, already the purview of writing a poem. If it speaks and you do not listen, it will disappear, carried off by a monkey, nattering, chattering, laughing all the way, saying, yes, you will hang about, and no, no thank you, not yet, to nirvana. Thank you all for listening. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you for the poetry, Elena. That was wonderful. And thank you again to Stephen and Donna. We would also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring the NSE program, making these daily conversations possible, and for supporting our archive on YouTube, where this conversation is shortly. For the past 22 years, the Rail has been a platform for arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to support our work here at the Rail, and our October issue is live now, so please do check it out. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Kim Kanadi, Edward Kopp, and Christina Yang on the event of Ruth Asawa Throughline at the Whitney. We will conclude with a reading by Cleo Abramian. And please join us also on Saturday at Industry City from 6 to 9 p.m. to celebrate the opening of Singing in Unison Part 8 Between Waves, curated by Alice Nien-Puko. We will be also celebrating the Rail's 23rd anniversary and the launch of our October issue. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and a huge thanks again to Donna and Stephen for the conversation. Congratulations, Stephen, on the book. And you can now all turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about the-
Take care.
I hope to see some of you on a river.